we're going to go over how to do that. So some of this information is things that you may already incorporate into your regular study methodology. Some of it brand new. Either way, the way to get the most out of this is to look at the information, figure out which things may work for you, and then go in that direction. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so some background about the science of learning. So there's a thing called cognitive load. This is your capacity to go over new information. It's your limitation. So you can see that your cognitive load is composed of two things, your working memory and your long-term memory. Your long-term memory is just like it sounds, things that you have retained over time because you studied it properly and you can remember it pretty well. That's almost an infinite amount of information you can access. And as a result of having a lot of it, your cognitive load or the amount of stuff you can go through is going to be a lot larger than a normal person. And you can kind of figure this out in terms of think of something you're really good at and ask yourself how much new information can you process about it. Obviously, if you know something really in and out, you can process a lot more information than the average person. The reason is because you have long-term memory that you can easily access in order to increase your capacity to deal with new information as it comes. The other component of your cognitive load is your working memory. And this is, as you can see, based on the size of the circle, much more limited. This is very small. You can do things to kind of increase your working memory, but that's kind of like your limiter. So let's get into this. So there's a limited amount of new information you can process that is called your cognitive load. The cognitive load is based on your working memory, which is the amount of information you can access as you do a task. So this is things you can readily access from the information that your brain has, and your long-term memory, which is basically the info you've effectively saved. So between the two of these, it determines your cognitive load. And as I just stated, the more things you could retain into your long-term memory, the better you're going to be able to handle new information. This is why it's important that whenever you're studying, your goal is to try to store more information into long-term memory so that you can access it later. Trying to just cram and jam, which is the most common methodology for studying, the issue with it is that that information is not really stored in your long-term memory. There's a process that your brain has to go through in order to save information for the long term. And when you cram and jam like the night before, you can't retain that information after that exam. And you will know this yourself. If you've taken a test after cramming and jamming, you'll know that within a week, the majority of the information you thought you learned is gone, right? So that's the issue with cramming and jamming. So the more information you have in your long-term memory, the more effective you're going to be in able to handle new information and do more challenging tasks. This is really the key to college. This is the reason you take AP classes and hard classes, because you want to have long-term memory on a variety of the more common topics you're going to see in college. Like if you're going for a science major, knowing biology, chemistry, physics, and all those things, having a long-term memory in those topics will make it much easier for you when you see them again in college. And you will see these topics again in college, whether you realize it or not. Even if you're an English major, you're going to see your full boat of science classes, kind of like high school. You are going to take classes you don't necessarily want to take. They're not part of your major because you have to. All right, maximizing working memory, things you can do. Since it is the weakest link and out of all this, there are things you can do to kind of improve it. And here are the things you can do. Make diagrams. Visuals are always an excellent way of increasing the capacity of your working memory. It'll make it easier for you to process the information. So when you see a question or any kind of challenging scenario or new information, doing a diagram of some sort, visual, will help you better handle that new information. Talking out loud, you may sound like you're special and look special, but it is very beneficial. Um, when you are able to speak it out loud and hear yourself, you're more likely to be engaged in the information and make more of it. Create steps. Majority of things you're going to see this year in chemistry, they're step-based. You follow the steps, your life is easy. You don't, you're going to have a much longer journey. So when you see a question or scenario, creating steps for yourself for how you're going to handle it and solve it is very beneficial. And reviewing notes in advance. I can't stress this enough. When you have a familiarity with a topic before you see it in a class or a lecture, you're going to be able to get much more out of that lecture session. Going into a lecture without knowing what's going on ahead of time, as you've already experienced is quite a journey because your mind can't process a good chunk of information. Probably a few minutes in, you're already zoned out in your own little world because you can't keep up with the new information. When you review it ahead of time and you build some sort of foundation, you don't have that as likely to occur. And if you think of classes you really enjoy and have a passion for, the reason you're able to do better in those classes is because you have more information about them and you're able to stay more engaged. And that's the key. When you review information ahead of time, you're able to stay more engaged with it. So that's a very useful thing to do if you want to get the most out of a class is look at the notes ahead of time. This class is kind of required, so you'll be doing it regardless, and you'll see the benefits. How does a person actually learn? Well, learning is a very complex process. You need to be engaged, motivated, and not stressed. Those three things are necessary. Engaged, and you could already know this yourself. If you have a class you really enjoy, you're more engaged, you know you're able to learn more in that class, right? But the problem is that a lot of your classes, you're not really choosing to take them, right? You're being forced to take them. Um, and as a result of that, you're not likely to be as engaged by it. And when you're not going to get as much out of that class. Motivation, you have to have some sort of objective or goal for doing well in the class or learning, right? You're forcing yourself to learn information you didn't ask for. Then itself is an extreme challenge. So you have to find a way to motivate yourself. The most common motivation, obviously, is your grades. And the grades, in turn, are going to help you dictate your career path and the college you go to, and then your parents, what their thoughts are. So that's the carrot that's thrown at you in high school and college is the letter grade. That's what's supposed to motivate you to do better. But as many of you probably have already experienced, that's not necessarily the greatest motivation tool. So sometimes you have to psych yourself out and create your own motivation. Because without a motivation of some sort, you're likely to struggle more academically than someone that is motivated. Not stressed. Very interesting, and we're going to talk about it in some more detail. But it turns out that when you're stressed, you're not learning. And for those of you that have ever tried to cram before a test and are completely stressed out, and no matter how many times you look at the material, you can't retain any of it, you understand the negative aspect of stress. So first off, it requires a person to be both process and store information. Person stressed can't do either. So if you are stressed, your mind is not going to be engaged. You're not making dopamine, which is basically the save button for your brain. When new information comes in your brain, if it's not prioritized, it just hangs out for hour, maybe a day if you're lucky, and then goes poof because your brain's like, okay, it's not important. Your brain can't just store everything you see and do, right? If it could, you would go insane. Imagine if you could remember everything you did in the last week, every single thing, all 24 hours of each day. That'd be insane, right? So your brain has learned to select what it's going to remember and retain. And the cue for it is you. If you prioritize or say this information is important, your brain is going to be able to then put it somewhere where then dopamine will help save the information. And when you're stressed, you really can't do that. So how do you learn information you never asked for? You create the most efficient system possible based on actual brain science. So I'm going to show you what current research has shown to be correct. Like we've had, in some cases, over a century worth of research on this stuff, and it's been shown to be extremely effective. And ironically, most students think it's counterintuitive and don't do these things because they're like either not aware of it or they think it's not going to help them because they think it takes time. But I can assure you that all these methods are extremely useful. This means understanding what research tells you, and then more specifically, what works for you. And that's the key to all this. I'm not trying to cram my methodology down your throat. I'm trying to make you aware of the different techniques and options out there you may or may not be aware of. And having taught for so many years, I can assure you that every student I've had that's been academically successful has had some combination of these skills or using some of these techniques in order to get the most out of themselves. And in turn, they are the most successful. So you want to develop something that's going to work for you. So keep that in the back of your head. Whatever techniques work, stick with. If it doesn't work, have a conversation with me or just say no to it. Eliminate it, go to the next technique. I have a very short leash on things I do. If something doesn't work for me, I'm very quick to dump it. So I suggest you do something similar. So first, let's talk about how to better store information. In order to store information, this is what you should do. First off, you need to be engaged. Make information interesting, and a lot of times the information is extremely dry. So once again, the stress is upon you to actually develop something to help you be more engaged. So you have to fake yourself out, right? You have to make something really dry and boring interesting for yourself so that your mind is like, okay, maybe we need to store this information. If you are not engaged, your mind's like, okay, this is garbage. I'm not going to do anything with this, and it'll delete it for you. That's just the way it works, right? So you have to be engaged by whatever you're doing, and you have to make it interesting for yourself. And there's ways of doing that. Prioritize it. Make info important to yourself. You know, you may not want to take a particular class or learn a particular topic, but if you don't prioritize it, your mind's not going to make it something you're going to store. And whether you realize it or not, all these classes you're taking, they build a foundation for bigger and more complicated things. So when you learn the basics of chemistry now or math now, it'll help you in the long run. It may not help you right away, it may not help you the next year, but at some point that information will have some usefulness. So keep that in mind. If you're going to spend time to try to learn something, do it properly so it actually becomes useful to you instead of just gets dumped. You need to be stress free. You have to be in a good mood. If you're in a bad mood, information goes and disappears. So things you can do to put yourself in a good mood before you start studying is extremely important. And that in turn will help your engagement, right? If you come in not wanting to do the homework, not wanting to stay for this class, forcing yourself to do it, no positive energy whatsoever, you're not going to be engaged. You're not going to prioritize, and the whole thing becomes garbage. So you have to first come in with the right mood. So do something you enjoy before you start, and then the engagement and prioritization comes into play. So you need to do three things in order to store information, make info interesting. So this is allows it to go into the safe center of your brain. If you don't make it interesting, it goes, like I said, to another location where it will get dumped. Convince yourself what you're learning is important. It doesn't get deleted automatically by your brain. If you do not convince yourself this is important, tell your mind this or convince it, it's going to go away by itself. You won't need to do anything. And you've experienced this. How many classes have you gone through a whole lecture and then at the end of the period, you don't remember anything in the lecture? That's just normal, guys. There's nothing out of the ordinary. Make sure you have a positive mood so the dopamine's released, which is your brain's safe key. So that's the key. You have to be in the positive mood. So doing things fun in between study sessions is a big bonus, and it's something I'd encourage you to do and something you have to do. All right, so things to do when you study. Do something that puts you in a good mood before you study. Make information interesting and possible, gross, funny, cute, or scary. Anytime you make information any of these things, it's more likely to stick. And you could think of this in terms of what has been the most memorable things you've experienced in your life, things that have some of these characteristics, or at least one of them, right? So if you try to associate new information in some way with one of these things, you're a little more likely to remember it. Create a routine you stick with so that you're consistent in your studies. I can't stress enough the importance of a routine. You have to have some sort of system of, okay, I'm going to study for this class on Mondays, regardless. Studying is not doing homework alone. That's a misconception. Homework in of itself is not studying. Studying is when you're dedicating X number of minutes or an hour, whatever it is, no more than an hour per day, um, on a specific topic or class. Why? Because that's when you get the most out of it. Trying to do this random thing where you're only studying before a test, you may get lucky on a test, but I can assure you in the finals, you're going to get your butt kicked. And whether you realize or not, all college classes are based on the premise that you have to retain information over at least a 10-week span, which is what a quarter is. So if you don't have a system that's going to let you have information stick for the long term, at least 10 weeks, you're going to have a really hard time in those classes because those finals are all cumulative. New information is easier to retain when we connect it to something we already know. Can't stress this enough. If you could connect something you're learning now to something you know before and create some sort of rope or connection between them, you're going to get the most out of being able to store that information for the long term. So the more times you're able to connect something new to something you know, the more beneficial it is. Now, obviously, some classes and some topics is impossible to do, but for whenever you can do it, it's extremely important you try to. The other thing you can always do is make sure you convince yourself the information is important. I know it's not always, how do you fake yourself out? You're going to have no choice. You have to at least store information for 20 to 40 weeks. for a typical year-long high school course, right? Especially cumulative ones, which is what all of them should be. All right, so if you look at this information and you try to rank it, you're going to try to, how do I put this? You're going to look at this stuff, and some of these things are going to be like, okay, this is stuff I do and it's very useful, and some of them are not. So I'm going to let you rank them. These are yourself. I'm not going to tell you what the ranking should be, and then we'll talk about it later in class and what strategies are most effective. But for each of these, basically 1 through 10, if you had to rank them, will be number 1 all the way down to number 10. All right, so what students think works versus what does not work. So they've done studies on this, and students are in denial. So they did a study, and basically what they did, they had different ways of different groups of how they studied for a class. So this group did study, 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 study. That's all they did. They just studied information, study information, study, study. So the amount of time all 3 groups spent is equal. Their methodology is different. So this group did all studying. This group did 3 studying and 1 retrieval. Retrieval means that instead of studying information, they didn't look at anything. They tried to recall what they learned. That's such a big deal. Retrieving information is the most important thing that majority of students don't do. Anytime you can sit and try to recall information without it in front of you is a time when you're able to stick information into long-term memory. So you really need to try to do this as often as possible. Try to recall information without anything in front of you. That's going to be the mantra for us this year. Retrieval, retrieval, retrieval. Retrieving from your memory is going to have much more benefits. So this group did all study. This did all 3 studies and 1 retrieval. This group did 1 study and 3 retrievals. So predicting, this group that did all study thought they were going to do the best. You could see that the majority thought they're going to kick butt. The second would be the ones that did majority study and retrieval. The ones that thought they're going to do the worst is the ones that did just 1 study and 3 retrievals. Look what reality was. Reality was the ones that did all studying scored the worst. The ones that did 3 study and 1 recall did the second best. Pretty good. I mean, almost double the score of the pure studying group. And the one that did 1 study and 3 recalls did the best. No surprise. The reason for it is real simple. When you are trying to take a test, you have to retrieve information from your memory. The more practice you have doing that, the more likely you're going to be able to do it on an exam. Think of it this way. If you put a book on a shelf somewhere without paying attention to where, how hard would it be for you to go back and locate that book? Especially if you never practice locating that book. Let's say hypothetically, you put the book somewhere and then you practice, or on a Monday or Tuesday, whatever, you go and you try to locate the book, and you located it. You retrieved it. How likely is it that a week or 2 later you'll be able to retrieve it? Now your mind knows where it's at, right? That's how information is. It's never lost in your memory except the stuff that's not important that goes away by itself. But anything you've stored to some degree, even if you are extremely good at storing, the difficulty for most kids is they can't retrieve the information. They can't access it. So whenever you are trying to retrieve it, you give your mind an opportunity to build a road to that piece of information. Imagine like your information is here, right? And you're here. Each time you try to recall information, your mind makes a road to it. Road. You have 3 different roads to this piece of information because you've done it on 3 different attempts, right? How likely is it for you to be able to access or locate this information? Pretty high. Versus a student that never tried to retrieve that information ever. And on a test is the first time they're doing it. You may get lucky, you may find it, but you're more than likely going to be going here or some other direction because your mind's not accustomed to locating it. So practice retrieving information as much as you can. All right, next, let's design a study system that is catered to you. Here are your 3 components. Interact with the material, that's one possible study session. Retrieve from memory, that's another. Assess learning. We're going to talk about each one. Interacting with material. Familiarize yourself with what you're learning. So this is when you're first going to access new information. So, you have a lecture that you're going to go over in class tomorrow. So you're going to practice looking it over the night before. You're going to preview it. So this is what you do. You always interact in this stage. Your choices for techniques are studying by reading the information from PowerPoint or other source material. Useful technique, not the best, but it's not bad. Much better, concept mapping. So you're going to build a concept map as you look at the information. Why is this one better? This is interactive. You're you're doing something actively versus passively. When you're studying, it's a passive event. When you are building a concept map as you're looking at information, it's more active. And I can assure you, through many years of teaching, this has been the most effective for most students, is building a concept map as they go. Vast majority said it's a very useful technique for them to be able to retain information for the long term and to make the information more accessible to them. Third, watching a video. So all my lectures have videos associated with them, and also have tutorials. So if you want to go that route, great. If you want to watch your own videos, great. That's fine. But these are your three options whenever you're getting access to information. Obviously, I suggest watching my video because it's going to be specific to what we're covering in class versus random. But if there's a specific topic in the lecture that you're like, I'm lost in, go to YouTube. It's fine. I'm not going to get offended. Stage 2, retrieve what you learned. Trying to do things from memory consistently is the most important way to make it more accessible. So the more times you try to just access things from your memory instead of looking at something while you're trying to go over it, the more beneficial you're going to have for that study session. Learn info is info you can recall from memory. Remember that. If you can't recall it, you didn't learn it. Simple as that. Your choice for techniques are as follows. Redoing your notes from memory, just like it sounds. You take a piece of paper and just redo them whatever way you want to. Outline, bullets, whatever floats your boat. Teach the material to someone. So you could pretend the wall is somebody and teach it to them. You could teach it to your parents. A lot of my students have tried to teach their siblings, their parents. When you can say it out loud and explain something properly, the information is going to stick much better. So for a lot of students, this is an extremely effective technique. When you can teach something, you have learned it yourself. You've mastered it yourself. So keep that in mind. Concept map, you're doing from memory. All three of these are without your notes. So whether you're teaching or doing your notes and concept mapping, you're doing this all from memory. You do not have your notes in front of you while you're doing it because that'd be useless. So this is what we call the retrieval stage. So keep that in mind. Cross-check all the above. So after you do this, especially in the beginning, cross-check it with your actual notes to see if you're accurate. Did you teach it properly? Did you explain the topic properly? Did you build a concept map properly? It's an extra 5 minutes of your life, but I can assure you it has the most benefits in terms of saving you time when you're studying for the exams. Stage 3, assessing yourself. This stage involves you applying what you learned. So it can be done for a study session or in combination with stage 2. So it's up to you whether you want to do it alone, like you're just going to do like a homework as a test. You're going to just do a test. Or if you want to combo it with like a stage 2, which is the most benefit. If you can start by retrieving information first for 5, 10, 15, whatever minutes you can do, and then taking this stage and doing an assessment, you're going to find yourself spending a lot less time studying and learning a lot more information. So try to combo this. You even combo with stage 1. Not ideal because you rather do it from memory than looking it over first, but in case you're completely lost and you have no choice. Your options self-test. So Moodle obviously has a whole bunch of them that you'll be able to see. You could also access things like Khan Academy. Some of you guys have Excel and other options for self-testing. So there's a host of options for this. Homework. Use the homework like a test and time it without using your notes. If nothing else in your life that you're going to change, always treat homework like a test and never use your notes when you're first doing it. If you're completely stuck at the end of it, go back, use your notes. That's fine. It's not the end of the world. But your first run through should always be treating homework as a test. Why? Because the more times you simulate test taking, less testing anxiety you're going to have, and the more likely you're going to be able to do well in exams because you know your content better because of this. Or third option is flashcards. So flashcards, we obviously have Anki, and we'll talk about that later. But for other classes, you could also do Quizlet. Anki is much better because what it does is spaces your practice for you and it automates it. But if you're dead set against and you're going to do something else for another class, fine, do something. These are all very useful techniques, and these should always be a part of studying for a specific topic or class. All right, so examples of study session. Start of a unit preview. Stage 1, I'm going to interact with the material by watching a video, 15 minutes, wonderful. Stage 2, retrieve what you learn using given S1s and make a concept map from memory and then cross-check with what you know. It's 15 minutes. So the whole thing took me 30 minutes. Comboing is extremely important. When you're first starting a unit, you're only going to do stage 1 by itself, right? You're going to be hard pressed to be able to handle retrieval. But if you're confident in your abilities, you're like, I really want to take myself to the next stage, then interact and then do a retrieval afterwards. And then that information you looked at will be so much more useful to you and more likely to be something you're going to have easy time with. But if you can't, just do interact. But ideally, you want to do 2 stages together. You don't want to typically do 1 stage by itself if you can avoid it. Worst case scenario, do it. But if you can do 2 stages together, please do so. Example 2, retrieve what you learned by reciting what you know about material out loud. So you're going to practice teaching somebody. Take 5 minutes for that. Stage 3, you're going to assess by doing all your homework without your notes. Best combination out of all the ones you can do. This is the best combo that you get the most benefits from, because you're practicing retrieval first and then you're going straight to an assessment, which is by far the most effective way to learn, is by testing yourself. There's nothing even close to it. Take a 15-minute break. Why? Because you shouldn't work more than 50 minutes to an hour in a single session. That's too much. So once you work an hour at the most, take a break, go do something you enjoy, get the dopamine back up, and then come back, use your notes, complete the questions you didn't get right or don't understand. I'd encourage you to write questions about the ones you don't understand. Ask me first, but for those who are like, I'm pressed for time or it's the night before, let's do, fine. Take this route. So what now? Start building your own study system and add or remove things as you develop something that'll work for you. Ideally, you want to do 2 stages in 1 session, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, to maximize the study session. Consider the following as you build your system. If a strategy doesn't work, get rid of it. If redoing your notes doesn't work, build a concept map. If it doesn't work, teach. If it doesn't work, come talk to me. We got to figure out something better for you. The more times you retrieve information from memory as part of a session, the quicker you'll learn the material. That's just a fact. Each time you retrieve that information, you're building a road, which means that you're going to store that information at a higher level. Don't rush to get things done. If you can't finish something in a session, move it to another session. Just because you have an hour, don't feel that you have to finish your homework. For my class, you typically have 3 days for an assignment. So if you start on time, you don't need to rush and do this kind of, I got to get this done tonight. Don't do that. Rules to become an efficient learner. Try to recall what you remember about a concept before you look at your notes. The more times you can recall from memory, the more benefits you're going to see. Don't copy notes, write them in your own words. I don't need you to transcribe my notes verbatim. That's a waste of your time. Write it in your own way. Make it useful to you. Make it an active event. Space out your learning. If you can only study 1 hour a week for a class, split up into 20 minutes in 3 days. Or do 30 and 30 in 2 different days. But space out those sessions, like you do it on Monday and then a Thursday. Why? That time in between will help you digest the information a little bit better. And when you have to work a little harder, 3 days later to access the information, you're going to be able to stick it into your memory much better. Don't stay stuck on a question. If you can't solve it in 5 minutes, move on with your life. Come ask me questions about it the next day. 5 minutes your limits, guys. If anything takes you longer than 5 minutes, stop, skip it, go to another question, which is easy, and then come back and ask me about it the next day. Or ask your house. Develop your study system with what works for you and you're willing to stick with. If it's not something you're going to do, don't fake it. It's not going to be useful to you or me. Do something that's going to work for you. If you do not have some sort of system for learning by the time you leave high school, college is going to be a nightmare. So please develop something you're willing to stick with, no matter how basic. If you're only using 1 or 2 pieces of what I'm going over, fine. It's better than nothing. You need to retrieve something 3 times from memory to make it stick. The more time you retrieve it, the better, but 3 is kind of like a classic. If you can remember it and recall it 3 times, you're going to more likely be able to use it long term. So keep that in the back of your head. Complete sequence for learning. Preview the lecture by making a concept map and writing down the questions you have. Perfect first step. Actively participate in lecture by answering questions and adding detail to your notes. Don't make lectures a passive event. Add things to your notes as you go. Reinforce the lecture 24 to 48 hours after to help it stick. That's the best case scenario. Don't let it stay too long into, not reinforcement stage. Reinforcing it a couple days later, do homework or something, or a session will give you more benefits. Do a study session over 1-2 days involving all 3 stages of the study system within a week. So you ideally want to do all 3 stages within a week on a topic. Stage 1, 2, and 3. 1 you're going to usually do before a lecture. 2 and 3 you're usually going to do as part of your, completing homework, ideally. So you're going to get all 3 sessions pretty easily. It's not going to be complicated. This now is because of the following information. So this basically shows you graduation rates for the first one is within 150% of normal time. So 6 years. Within 6 years, how many students have graduated college, basically? So all institutions, 64%. So basically, we're looking at 36% of students that just don't graduate within 6 years. Maybe never. We don't know for sure. But they don't graduate within 6 years, which is typical, the longest amount of time a student takes to study. So you can see that males are less likely to graduate than females. 67% of females do. Males are 60. For public institution, females again 60%, 66% versus 60. Private nonprofit, these are basically like your USCs. These are your more acclaimed schools, your Harvards, 64 and 71. So higher, at least for the males, for private nonprofit than having public. The reason is that these schools are designed to give you much more support, so this more likely you're going to be able to finish. And also getting into them are harder, so you're more likely more talented, so you're more likely to get out. Private for profits. These are the schools that advertise to you to try to get you to join them instead of you looking for them. Look at the graduation rates. This is why you do not go to any college that has a commercial on TV. It's not going to, you're going to be wasting money and time, and you're also more likely not going to graduate. So if a college is just looking for you that you never heard of, avoid them. Take a different route. Then they don't have high graduation rates. This is graduation rate for normal time for students that first attended some sort of 2-year junior college, just like your Mission College, your Santa Monica College. They're called JUCOs, junior colleges, community colleges. Typically what happens, you go there for 2 years, and then after 2 years, you're able to transfer to a college. So take a look at their graduation rates. 34%. This is not to tell you that junior colleges are bad, because some of them are really good, and for some students it's better to have 2 more years to save money, to develop your skills, and then transfer than it is to get to go into a school you don't want to. Like, you got your acceptance for different schools, none of them you're really high on. Go to JUCO or junior college and then transfer over. That's a good option. So the problem is a lot of students do it because the next step without having any thought. Students that shouldn't go to college per se, meaning they should go to trade school, pick a different route, because academics is just not their route. Academics is not for everybody. You can get the most out of academics by using the right techniques, but even then, it's not for everybody, right? So for those students, these are the graduation rates. You can see that even after transferring, not all of them are able to graduate, except for for-profit, which is kind of funny, right? And the reason for it here is because you're paying, and for whatever reason, it's a weird stat, you have a higher chance of graduating in this situation. So that's the study system. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what to do and how to improve your learning.